Have you ever stood before a dazzling door where the light inside burned so bright you could almost hear the laughter, the clinking of glasses, only for that door to slam shut right in your face? Not because you lacked money, not because you lacked achievement, but simply because someone's gaze decided you don't belong. That is the sting of exclusion, etched not on paper but in the cold stare, the smug smile, the words coated in silk but lined with thorns. And for someone black, that moment is never just a single rejection. It is memory replayed, dozens, even hundreds of times, stretching from past to present. Each time the demand is the same. Prove you are enough in a world determined to believe you are not. And yet, in those very moments, something higher ignites. A longing not just to walk through that door for yourself, but for all who've been kept outside. Not for vengeance, but to prove that dignity and justice can be found, even in silence. That night, when Naomi Carter's name was crossed off the guest list of an opulent charity gala, they assumed she would leave quietly. But what they didn't know was that before the night was over, she wouldn't just step inside, she would flip the entire game in a way no one could have predicted. This story begins with rejection, but it will end with a cold, cutting smile. The kind of smile where justice arrives in the most unexpected form. If you've ever lived or even witnessed moments of injustice like this, leave a like, share this story with someone who needs it, and don't forget to subscribe with the little bell on. Because the stories we tell here aren't just entertainment. They're about turning the tables one moment at a time. And now let's step into that glittering night. The golden lights, the shimmering gowns, the air thick with privilege, and a black CEO standing before a door that was never meant to open for her. That night, the city dressed itself in splendor. The street before the Marquis Hotel glowed under rows of golden lamps spilling across marble stone, where sleek cars pulled up one after another. Drivers opened doors, gowns spilled out like waves, high heels tapped in rhythm. The music of wealth itself. Laughter carried, hands waved, small bursts of applause broke out whenever a familiar face of the elite appeared. The air was sharp with pride, thick with expensive perfume mingling with wine. Naomi Carter stood at the top of the steps. The black gown hugging her frame left her no less radiant than anyone there. The pearls at her throat spoke quiet elegance, her proud eyes catching the light as though she were already part of the gala. But there was an invisible emptiness. In her hand, no invitation. The doorman, immaculate in his suit, walked toward Naomi. His eyes scanned her like a defective item. A long second passed, then his lips bent into a strained smile. Meant to hide disdain, though not enough to pass for courtesy. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said softly, his tone like a favor being granted. "Your name isn't on the list. Perhaps you have the wrong address." Naomi didn't move. The words fell like ice. Her face remained composed, though her eyes flickered. In that brief instant, memories surged. Childhood days standing outside the gates of a prestigious school, listening to the laughter of wealthy children she was never allowed to play with. The same wound, only dressed now in satin and pearls. Behind her, a couple approached. The man adjusted his tie, glanced at Naomi, and murmured to his companion, "She must be lost. Probably staff." They chuckled, unbothered by whether she heard. Naomi turned slightly but didn't reply. Instead, her fingers brushed lightly over the pearls at her neck. A small gesture, but charged with defiance. Anyone observant enough would see it. This wasn't the gaze of someone misplaced. It was the gaze of someone watching, recording every detail as though a script was being written in her mind. The doorman cleared his throat, impatient. "I'm afraid you'll need to return once you have an official invitation. Tonight is not for passers-by." The word passers-by slid from his mouth soft, but sharp, like a velvet-coated blade. Naomi smiled, not weakly, but with a quiet, mocking lift of the lips. In her silence, she had spoken louder than any protest. Inside, violins began their overture, opening the gala. The heavy doors closed in Naomi's face, the scrape of metal cutting off the golden light. She remained on the cold stone steps, still as an outcast in shadow. Yet in that silence her eyes narrowed, sharp as steel. They thought they had shut her out. In truth, Naomi had just laid the first stone of a game they didn't even know they were playing. They believed they'd closed a door on her. What they didn't know was that Naomi was preparing to open a much larger one, a door the entire Gala would never forget. The echo of the leather shoes struck the marble. Measured, deliberate, like the drumbeat of a march. The event manager appeared, tall, gaunt, his tailored suit like armor. His face wore a professional smile, but his eyes betrayed a cold, cheap glint. He stopped before Naomi, drew a shallow breath, and gave a half bow, a gesture with no respect in it. "Excuse me," he said, his voice polite but edged with a hidden knife. "This space is for those who belong." Those last words stretched out, not to emphasize, but to savor the act of placing her outside the boundary. It was an unwritten order. Some are inside, others remain outside. And tonight, Naomi was cast outside. She heard every syllable as if carved into glass before her, yet she didn't answer. She met his eyes, her dark pupils burning with quiet pride. Her silence unsettled him. He had expected pushback, some clumsy plea so he could summon security. But Naomi denied him that privilege. Behind her, guests streamed past, treating her as if she were invisible. Their glances all alike, surprise laced with certainty, affirming that her exclusion was natural. They lifted their chins, straightened scarves, and slipped inside. The great doors sealed shut behind them. Naomi drew a slow breath. Humiliation seared through her body, burning hot like fire, yet freezing cold like ice. It was the strange ache of being halted just before she was meant to shine. A part of her longed to turn away, to let silence swallow the pain. But a deeper part, steadier, stronger, was awakening. In her mind, Naomi saw black women who had come before her, women halted at thresholds, yet who stood tall. Their image steadied her. She neither entered nor left. She remained, a silent protest, a mirror reflecting the glittering lie within. The manager frowned. He wasn't used to silence like this. He wanted her to shrink, to vanish, to lash out, anything that gave him power. Instead, she stood calm, unsettling. Naomi tilted her head slightly, a faint smile touching her lips. Not joy, but the smirk one gives a poor joke. A smile that said, "You think you hold the power, but you're only a gatekeeper in a game you don't understand." In that instant, the balance shifted, even though she still stood outside. Her silence weighed heavier than any protest, planting the seed for a night full of reckoning. They thought Naomi was just an outcast left on the steps. They didn't realize she was already turning this humiliation into the spark of an upheaval that would shake the gala itself. Naomi stayed rooted on the cold stone. The doorman had turned away, but the words, "those who belong," lingered in the air, clinging like perfume on a collar. She blinked, and the world before her blurred into memory. She was 10 again, worn shoes, patched uniform, standing outside iron gates of a private school. Inside, blonde children tossed a red ball across green grass, their laughter echoing as if they were the center of the universe. Naomi pressed her face to the bars, longing for just one entry. But the heavy wooden door never opened. Instead, a teacher passed by, frowned, and shook his head. "This place isn't for you." The memory stabbed, but it didn't break her. It sharpened her composure. All her life she had learned, silence isn't surrender. It is a weapon, a hidden blade, waiting for its moment. They mistook her for weak, when in truth she was waiting. Naomi rolled her shoulder as if brushing off dust from the past. She looked at the great doors closed tight, behind them violins and laughter bouncing off gilded ceilings. The game was familiar. Charity worn to mask greed, civility worn to mask prejudice. They thought by closing that door they held the world in their hands. But Naomi knew, Every door has hinges and every hinge can break. A cold wind swept by, carrying fuel fumes and perfume, stinging her face. And in that sting, she caught the bitter irony. They, the ones who belonged, lived in fragile illusion. She, the one cast out, was the only one standing on solid ground. Naomi smiled, this time deliberately. Her lips curved, her eyes gleamed with cunning. She didn't need to break the door. She only had to wait for the precise moment when the entire building would open to her. Not out of goodwill, but out of her own power. That silence wrapped around her like a cloak. Inside her mind, the gears had begun to turn. From the little girl locked out of the schoolyard to the woman barred at the gala, it was all one circle. But this time, the circle would not close with rejection. It would close with a reversal. They thought Naomi was frozen in the dark, swallowing shame. But in truth, she was sharpening her silent blade, ready to drive it straight into the heart of arrogance. In the chill of the stone steps, with the golden light from the gala doors spilling out like mockery, Naomi suddenly recalled a familiar face. A memory not far away, just a few months back, at a business gathering. The man, with his easy smile and a hand forever extended as if to connect the entire world, had approached her, introducing himself with a warm, affable tone. His name was Richard Hale, a white businessman famed for his real estate ventures and his deep ties within the elite circle. Back then, he had looked at Naomi with enthusiasm, as though he'd finally found a worthy exception to showcase. His words dripped with honey. "Naomi, I admire your journey. Someone like you needs to be present at major events. I'll introduce you to the most important people. You deserve to be there." Naomi had nodded, offering a quiet thanks. But within, she kept her caution. She knew that promises in this world were like glasses of wine. Heady at first sip, but left overnight, they soured into bitterness. Still, she wanted to believe, because after years of exclusion, sometimes a key offered from another's hand seemed worth taking, if only to test the lock. Tonight, standing outside the gala doors, Naomi thought of Richard with a bitter sense of irony. He was the same man who had clapped her on the shoulder and said, "Trust me, places like these will one day see you as indispensable." Yet here she was, shut out while he was likely inside, sipping champagne, laughing along with the crowd. Naomi lifted her head, exhaling slowly. In that moment, Richard's memory no longer glowed with promise, but instead reflected half-hearted power. True power wasn't the privilege of entering on someone else's grant. True power was holding the key to open the door yourself. She remembered that autumn afternoon when Richard had promised to take her into the important rooms. His gaze had carried not pure respect, but the gleam of a collector flaunting another rare piece. Naomi had seen it, but stayed silent. Not out of trust, but out of curiosity, to see where such charity would lead her. Now it was clear. It had led her here, before a door slammed shut, with an invitation that never existed. Naomi's lips curved into a half-smile. She no longer saw Richard as an ally. He was merely a power collector, binding others with empty promises so they'd owe him gratitude. To Naomi, such allies were more dangerous than open enemies. They thought a promise could keep her waiting outside forever. But they didn't know. This very betrayal had just handed Naomi the perfect reason to flip the board. Her phone buzzed softly in her purse, a message arriving. Naomi stepped off the stone steps, seeking a quieter space away from the doorman's watchful eyes. Moving toward the side corridor of the hotel, where dim golden lights washed over still potted plants, she froze at a voice she knew. Richard Hale. His voice echoed through the phone, confident yet dripping with counterfeit warmth. Naomi stopped, hiding behind a granite wall, listening. "Yes, I handled it," Richard said, his deep voice brimming with smugness. "That name, Naomi Carter, won't appear on tonight's list. Trust me, letting her in would only make people uncomfortable. I don't want trouble for anyone." A pause, then his short laugh, polished but cruel. She thinks she made it into the circle. Truth is, I only hinted at it so she wouldn't bother me again. Simple. Naomi clenched her phone so tight her knuckles turned white. A cold shiver rippled down her spine. The promise of access had not just been empty, it had been a sweetly set trap to erase her cleanly. He hadn't just broken his word. He had turned her into a pawn, a joke, a disposable offering to gain favor with the hosts. In the shadows, Naomi bit her lip hard enough to nearly draw blood. Yet instead of breaking down in rage, a faint, bitter smile flickered on her lips. A smile that was both pain and mockery. Because this wasn't just betrayal, it was the oldest lesson in power. People value you only when your presence serves them. The moment you threaten their position, they cut you out with sweetness, sharp as a blade. Naomi slowly lifted her gaze, staring at the glass that reflected light from the gala hall inside. In that reflection, she didn't see an outcast. She saw someone freed from an illusion. Richard thought that striking her name preserved his place, but in truth, he had ended any thread of trust she had ever held in his world. Richard's voice drifted further away, fading with each step. Naomi closed her eyes, letting his words dissolve into the air. She didn't need to hear more. The truth was already sharp enough. When she opened them again, her pupils gleamed with icy resolve. If before she had hesitated, now this betrayal had struck the match to the waiting coals. And once lit, those coals would not burn a single promise. They would set the entire arrogant gala ablaze. They thought by cutting her out, they removed a threat. What they didn't see was that their betrayal was the first crack in their gilded wall. The crack that warned the whole structure was about to collapse. Naomi stood still in the dim corridor, where golden light fell in broken patches on stone. Richard's footsteps faded, but his words still hung in the air, a dull refrain sharp enough to wound. She needed no reminder. Betrayal was crystal clear, beyond excuse. She leaned back against the wall, exhaling softly. Not the breath of someone defeated, but of one who had just faced a brutal truth she had long suspected. This wasn't Naomi's first knife in the back. Her life had been filled with smiling faces that hid quiet exclusion. The sweetest promises she knew were always spoken right before the fastest betrayals. Naomi chuckled under her breath. A short, dry, ironic sound. Not from joy, but from the absurdity of men who thought themselves clever. Richard might believe he'd been sly, but to Naomi his betrayal was nothing more than a tired script she had seen too many times. This time, though, it was different. Naomi was no longer the young girl pressed against the schoolyard fence, hungry eyes yearning for entry. She was no longer the intern straining for a seat at the table. Now she was a woman with power, intelligence, and the experience to know that betrayal could be opportunity. She glanced at her reflection in the glass, her features hardened, her eyes unflinching. This betrayal didn't shrink her. It elevated her. She knew if she wanted to go farther than anyone inside that hall, she had to turn every stab in the back into a step upward. And Naomi was ready. In silence, she pictured the gala within, gowns sweeping across the floor, practiced smiles, crystal glasses clinking in shallow toasts. They believed their world unshakable, untouchable. They raised glasses to false ideals of charity, even as they erased names like Naomi from their lists. What they didn't know was that arrogance always left a crack. Naomi adjusted the pearls at her throat. Their light gleamed back at her like a reminder. She carried her worth with her. No one else defined it. And when her moment came, her silence would thunder louder than all the applause within that gilded room. They thought Naomi would bow her head, turn away, and disappear like those before her. But they didn't know. This time, betrayal would not make her fall. It would be the tremor that shook the board, and Naomi was already preparing the move that would topple every piece. The gala doors burst open, sending a wave of warm air and the scent of wine spilling into the hallway where Naomi stood. A guest staggered out, middle-aged, his cheeks flushed with liquor, clutching a half-empty champagne flute. He swayed as though the music inside still pulsed through his body. His eyes landed on Naomi. For a split second, confusion flickered across his face, then gave way to the easy arrogance of a man used to giving orders. He cleared his throat, lifted his chin, and without so much as a greeting, shoved his empty glass toward her. "You," he slurred, but with all the false authority of entitlement. "Bring me another, the French one, the kind only VIPs drink, quickly." Naomi didn't move. Her dark eyes caught the golden light of the hallway. In that instant, she understood perfectly. In his gaze, her tailored black gown, her elegant pearls, her unshaken poise, all of it vanished. He saw only one thing: a servant, an invisible attendant in the background of his comfortable life. She gave no answer. No step forward, no protest, just silence. And that silence unsettled him. His brows knit, his tone rose, his words stretched into a command meant to crush. "Did you not hear me? Bring me wine. What are you standing there for?" A couple stepping out of the hall caught the scene. They glanced at Naomi, then at the man, and laughed softly. The woman tilted her head, whispering, "She really does look like staff." Their chuckle rang out like applause to his humiliation act. Naomi tilted her head, lips curving into a faint smile. Not agreement, not surrender. A razor-thin smile, mocking, almost amused, exposing the absurdity of it all. To onlookers, that silence and smile were not defeat. They were control. Because if Naomi snapped back, she would hand them the angry woman stereotype they were baiting her into. If she showed outrage, she would become their caricature. But silence let their arrogance echo against itself, bare, unmasked, and ridiculous. The man staggered closer, frustrated by her stillness. What he didn't know was that when he thrust that empty glass toward her, Naomi captured every detail: the tilt of his chin, the red flush on his cheeks, the false superiority laced through his drunkenness. She held it quietly, because in her silence a plan was already forming. That glass, empty tonight, would soon become the very symbol of how hollow this entire gala truly was. They thought they had forced Naomi into the role of an invisible servant. But with a single sardonic smile, she had turned humiliation into fire, the spark that would ignite the reversal no one saw coming. The man laughed, short and sharp, lifting his glass higher as if to blind her with the chandelier's reflection. "Go on, bring me another," he insisted, slurring his words with mock command. As if Naomi had been born to wait in the hallway for his whims, other guests spilled into the lobby just in time to witness it. They didn't speak, only exchanged knowing glances before breaking into snickers. Their laughter, quiet but cutting, turned the hallway into a stage, and Naomi into a character she had never chosen, the invisible help. But Naomi's shoulders stayed squared, her gaze unflinching. She offered no excuse, no denial, because she knew, in moments like this, words were useless. Every defense only locked the shame tighter to her image. Silence instead became a far sharper weapon. The man grew restless. He lowered the glass, staring hard at Naomi before sneering loud enough for the others to hear. "You must be new. What's the holdup? They pay you to work, not to stand there smiling." Laughter erupted again, this time sharper, louder. A woman in a red gown tilted her head, studying Naomi as though confirming a fact. Yes, just staff. The pack had found its entertainment. Naomi still didn't flinch. Her eyes cooled into something unreadable, both piercing and detached. Her lips curved in that faint, almost imperceptible smile. Not of tolerance, but of someone watching a clown unravel in his own act. What they didn't know was that Naomi was recording every sneer, every laugh, every word. Not with a camera, but with the unblinking clarity of memory. Each insult wasn't breaking her down. It was gathering fuel. And soon, that fuel would ignite a move that left them all silent. Seconds dragged. The man's hand trembled with impatience, glass still outstretched. The bystanders laughed harder, convinced they'd stumbled onto a free show. but they failed to notice how their own laughter was the real spectacle. Naomi remained, present, steady, undeniable. They thought they had caged her in the role of the nameless help. What they didn't realize was that the moment had turned into a mirror reflecting their emptiness, their vulgarity, and Naomi was ready to make it the opening scene of her reversal. She tilted her head slightly. The overhead light caught her pearls, scattering a fragile but defiant glow around her throat. She didn't move, didn't lower herself. Her lips curled into that same enigmatic smile, not the smile of someone broken, but of someone watching fools stumble through their own farce. The air shifted. The man froze mid-gesture as though doused with cold water. He was used to quick compliance, to nods and scurrying feet, but here in front of him stood a woman unmoving. Silent, smiling, a defiance stronger than any spoken rebuttal. The laughter around them faltered. What had been amusement curdled into unease. Naomi's silence unsettled the crowd. They didn't know how to react. If she had cried, they'd cheer. If she had shouted, they'd sneer. But silence left them exposed, their cruelty glaring under the lights. The drunk man raised his glass higher, desperate to reclaim the stage. "Does she not understand English?" he barked, turning for approval. But the same crowd that laughed seconds before now avoided his eyes. Even they sensed something had shifted. Naomi's silence had drained the humor, leaving only discomfort. Naomi's gaze stayed locked on him, steady as steel. Without a word, she forced him to stumble, not from liquor, but from the weight of her stare. In her mind, flashes of past humiliation surged, smirks across boardrooms, whispers behind her back at conferences, stares in fine restaurants. But tonight was different. Tonight, she no longer felt the sting. She saw only the smallness, the ridiculousness of men who believed they towered above. She knew the truth. In any game of power, sometimes the move is to let the opponent believe they're winning. Let them flaunt, let them sneer, let them expose themselves. Then, when the board flips, their arrogance becomes evidence. A sudden draft swept the hallway, rattling the man's glass with a shrill clink. The sound cut the air like a signal. The humiliation act was over, but the real storm, the one Naomi was preparing, had only just begun. They thought her silence meant defeat. What they didn't know was that her silence was the first rumble of a storm, and when it broke, not a soul in that hall would be left standing. Behind the closed doors, another world revealed itself. A vast hall glittered beneath a ceiling lined with gold, hundreds of chandeliers blazing like an artificial galaxy. Violins poured out their polished notes, smooth and intoxicating, wrapping the night in a false kind of intoxication. On the polished wooden floor, gowns of sapphire, wine red, and ivory drifted past in shimmering waves. An opulent river set in motion. Women sparkled under the light, diamonds the size of grapes flashing at their throats and fingers. Men tugged at bow ties, their tuxedos cut to perfection, their movements choreographed with rehearsed precision. Every handshake, every laugh was staged, smiles calibrated to last just long enough, nods timed to signal warmth without sincerity. Silver trays glided through the crowd, balancing flutes of champagne whose bubbles rose like scripted applause. Crystal glasses chimed in a delicate chorus, weaving into the violin's melody. To the untrained eye, it looked flawless. But beneath the shine, Naomi saw it. The faint odor of deception. The sense that if you scratched the surface, the glossy veneer would peel back to reveal rotting wood. From the outside, through the tall glass pane, Naomi observed. Each face told a story. Smiles stretched too tightly, eyes flicking sideways to check who was watching. A performance, every gesture of it, and this gala was their grandest stage. A platinum-haired woman laughed as she recalled her European vacation, but jealousy flared in her gaze the moment someone mentioned a new yacht. A man gripped hands with officials one after another, his palms slick with sweat, his eyes pinned greedily to the business cards in his fist. Naomi inhaled sharply, her chest tightening. Exclusion wasn't just about being left off a list. It lived here in this heavy air of self-satisfaction, where greed and insecurity hid behind sequins and crystal. And instead of longing to step inside, Naomi let out a quiet laugh. Because she realized this wasn't paradise. It was theater. A lavish stage where everyone was terrified of dropping their mask. They thought this gala was proof of power, a monument to belonging. But Naomi knew the truth. Masks always crack. And when they do, the faces beneath them are what shock the crowd. The violins swelled, but behind their polished notes, Naomi caught the voices slipping through like cracks in marble. Brutal words disguised as elegance. People like us were born to sit here, a silver-haired man declared, gold pin gleaming on his collar. He swirled his champagne as if taking inventory of the room. The woman beside him, in a scarlet gown with a thigh-high slit, laughed brightly. And others, they were born to serve. The world needs order, doesn't it? At the same table, the heirs of dynasties smirked, eager to contribute. One bragged of hunting trips in Africa as though recounting a weekend hobby. Their laughter rang out, not at the story itself, but at the pride of privilege unearned, privilege inherited. Elsewhere, two men leaned close, voices pitched just loud enough to be overheard. I hear there are some new companies led by black entrepreneurs, one sneered, lips curling. They think a few contracts put them on our level? Absurd. His companion sipped his drink and added smoothly, the outside looks polished, but inside? They'll never understand what it means to truly belong. Naomi heard it all. Every word pierced her like a gilded blade. Never a killing strike, but slow, deliberate cuts meant to bleed dignity drop by drop. She studied them. These people wrapped in luxury, yet betraying themselves with every careless laugh. The order they clung to wasn't about strength. It was fear, fear of being replaced. Their boasts were proof enough. Deep down, they knew their power was fragile. Naomi's lips curved in a faint, sardonic smile. This wasn't elegance, it was farce. A collective masquerade where arrogance passed for confidence. They thought their words were witty banter, but Naomi knew better. They were fractured mirrors, reflecting the truth they couldn't admit. Through the glass, Naomi's eyes stayed steady. Every laugh, every whisper became a curtain, lifting to expose the raw machinery underneath. The silk gowns, when arms wrapped in false embraces, weren't clinging to friendship but to fear. The confident gazes of tuxedoed men weren't fixed on noble ideals, only darting across lists of benefits. Masks of grandeur, but to Naomi, the glue was already cracking. She caught a young couple murmuring about vacations abroad, their perfume heavy in the air. But when the husband mentioned another woman's name, the wife's smile faltered, bitterness flashing before it drowned again under gloss. A politician grinned for the camera, hands clasping tightly. Then, as soon as the flash died, his face collapsed into emptiness, as if even he didn't believe in the role he was playing. Naomi laughed inwardly. Not the laugh of someone left outside, but of someone who sees through the act. These glittering people, with all their jewels and wealth, were no different than children in costumes. Dressed as royalty, but trembling beneath the mask, terrified of being called out as not enough. And Naomi understood something sharp, almost cruel in its irony. Those who claimed the right to decide who belonged were themselves shackled in a greater play. They couldn't stop performing, couldn't drop their masks, because the moment they did, their entire illusion would collapse. Naomi drew a deep breath. The weight in her chest eased. She no longer craved entry because she saw clearly. There was nothing real inside. Only shallow vanity polished under chandeliers. Only deceit, served sweetly in sparkling glasses. And in that moment she understood. She didn't need to force her way in. She already stood on firmer ground. Truth, pride, and the unshakable power of silence. They thought they lived in a castle built forever. But Naomi had already seen the cracks in the stone. And soon those cracks would spread until the walls themselves came crashing down, exposing every face they had fought so hard to hide. Naomi stepped away from the hallway where the drunken guests had spat out their insults, her heels tapping lightly against the cold marble floor. She didn't rush to leave, nor did she attempt to slip into the party. Instead, she followed the curve of the building, seeking a quiet corner to gather her thoughts. Her steps brought her near a side room where the door hung slightly ajar and a dim light spilled out. Whispers leaked from inside. Low, hurried, calculated. Naomi froze. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the words struck her ears so clearly she couldn't ignore them. The donations tonight, we don't have to transfer all of it. Some will be recorded, the rest... Who's going to track it? A man's voice, sharp with cynicism, followed by a dry, brittle laugh. Another voice chimed in, hesitant. But what if the press asks questions? The first man laughed louder, his tone dripping with mockery. We'll give them pretty pictures, heartwarming stories. The public only needs to see gowns, violins, and oversized checks. No one cares where the money goes as long as they believe we did something noble. A chill ran down Naomi's spine. What she heard wasn't idle gossip, it was the raw truth. The glittering charity gala was nothing more than a shell, hiding a sophisticated scheme of embezzlement. These so-called pillars of society were nothing more than merchants cloaked in false virtue. She lingered, catching fragments of their plotting. The breakdown of diverted funds, fabricated humanitarian stories, the reassurance that certain journalists had already been bought. None of this was improvised, it was a machine, rehearsed and repeated year after year. Naomi bit her lip, eyes narrowing with scorn. The irony burned. They had cut her from the guest list, claiming she didn't belong. Yet here she was, an outsider holding the very truth that could shatter the entire facade. In the shadows, Naomi shook her head. She didn't need to force her way in. They had already painted their own portrait with careless whispers, and when that portrait came into the light, it would horrify the audience far more than any polished speech ever could. They thought they controlled the stage with champagne and violins. But Naomi knew better. One slight tug at the curtain, and the entire masquerade would collapse to reveal the sordid fraud underneath. She drew back silently, pressing into the shadowed wall, ears tuned to every word. The more she heard, the sharper the truth cut through the glamour. This was no night of goodwill. It was a theater of lies where chandeliers and string quartets served as props to mask filth. The charity fund was nothing more than a communal wallet for the powerful. Numbers were redrawn with a few signatures, the money rerouted through shell companies, false investment funds, only to circle back into their own pockets. Meanwhile, the public saw nothing but glossy magazine spreads. Elegant women in the silk gowns, men raising glasses, and those giant checks paraded before cameras. Naomi clenched her teeth. She remembered the families outside, people who desperately needed every donated dollar. Children with illnesses, their faces once paraded in tearful speeches. Now she realized, those lives had been reduced to props for a performance of false generosity. In the darkness, her lips curled into a bitter smile. The cruel irony was clear. The very people parading in spotless white and polished shoes were dirtier than any stain they had ever projected onto her. She glanced back through the glass. Inside, champagne glasses still clinked. Laughter still rang out as if the world was spotless. To them, Naomi was expendable. But the truth she now carried made it clear. They were the ones unworthy. Parasites dressed as benefactors, selling greed as charity, deceit as kindness. Naomi almost wanted to laugh out loud to let her voice rip through the gold leaf walls and drown the violin's lullaby. But she restrained herself. Truth once revealed would roar louder than any single laugh. And tonight, justice had quietly tilted in her favor, though no one inside knew it yet. A draft slipped through the narrow window, tugging at the hem of her black dress. Naomi closed her eyes, drawing in a lungful of cold air. In that moment, she no longer felt excluded. She stood instead as witness, an uninvited judge holding the scales of justice in her hands. She recalled the mocking words, "This space is for those who belong." Now they sounded hollow, even absurd. belong? If corruption and hypocrisy were the ticket in, Naomi knew with certainty she needed no such admission. She didn't need to belong in a room drowning in pretense. She needed something greater, truth. Her gaze hardened. This was no longer their game. It had become hers. They had handed her the sharpest weapon, truth. And when unleashed at the right moment, it would not only puncture the Gala, it would bury it beneath the weight of its own lies. They thought they had diminished Naomi by excluding her. But tonight, through their own corruption, they had handed her the power to recalibrate the scales. And once those scales tipped, no one under the chandeliers would ever hold their heads high again. Naomi walked slowly out of the hall, her heels striking against the stone steps like measured cuts marking the night. The Gala doors closed behind her, sealing in the glitter and the smug laughter. She didn't look back. Instead, her hand tightened around the small clutch as she made her way to the waiting car at the curb. Sliding into the back seat, Naomi leaned against the cool leather, her breathing settling into a steady rhythm. Outside, the city at night stretched like a vast mirror. Streetlights streamed into long golden trails, weaving with neon signs that blinked in restless pulses, each reflection catching on the glass as the car rolled forward. Every flicker of light carried back a memory from the evening. The guard's contemptuous glare, Richard's laugh over the phone, the wine glass thrust out in humiliation, and finally, the whispered conspiracy behind that half-open door. Naomi's gaze remained fixed on the cityscape, but her mind was sharpening into a single point of clarity. She had everything she needed to act: exclusion, betrayal, public humiliation, and then the unvarnished truth. Scattered fragments had now formed into a complete picture. At this moment, silence itself became her sharpest weapon. The car moved slowly through wide streets, the glow of lamps spilling onto rain-slick pavement. Naomi pressed her hand against the window, feeling the chill through the glass, as if she were touching the thin barrier between noise and stillness. In that hush, she realized, silence wasn't emptiness, it was momentum. It was the deep breath before the final strike. A smile touched her lips, not the bitter smile of earlier, but the smile of someone holding the winning card. She didn't need to shout in a crowded hall or argue with those who thrived on humiliation. She only needed silence, and then the right action. When the doors opened again, they wouldn't see Naomi cast aside. They would see Naomi turn the entire room upside down. Outside, a neon sign flashed the word charity in blazing red before sputtering into darkness, leaving a hollow gap between bursts of light. Naomi let out a quiet laugh. It was the perfect image of that gala. Dazzling brightness, but nothing more than a bulb ready to burn out, exposing the darkness behind it. She tilted her head, catching her own reflection in the glass. The city lights traced a cold gleam across her features, making her eyes look deeper, more unyielding. For the first time all night, Naomi felt light, because she knew the storm had already formed in silence. Soon the hall behind her would tremble under its weight. They thought Naomi had left defeated, retreating into silence. What they didn't know was that within this silence the storm had begun, and it would break over them at the height of their arrogance. Inside the car, the city lights swept across her face, slicing it into shifting bands of brightness and shadow. The world outside pulsed with noise, but within the car, everything was hushed. Naomi leaned back, her eyes closing halfway before she opened them again, slowly, deliberately. She lifted her phone, dialing familiar numbers with a hand that did not shake. The first call was to her lawyer. He answered with mild surprise at the late hour, but within moments of hearing her clipped sentences, his tone hardened into urgency. Naomi needed no long explanations. Her words were precise, deliberate, carrying both instruction and command. Prepare the documents, review the contracts, open the path for a transaction tonight. Not tomorrow morning, she said evenly. Tonight. There was a pause, then the swift, decisive agreement of a man who understood the stakes. Naomi nodded slightly as if he were sitting beside her. Ending the call, she moved directly to the next number, a partner known only to a select few in business circles. The man never appeared in magazines, never courted the spotlight, but his influence was enough to tilt entire markets. Naomi's tone with him was steady, almost serene. Not the tone of someone asking for favors, but of an equal setting strategy. Every sentence was deliberate, as though she had been waiting years to deliver them. She spoke of property, of ownership rights, of the need for signatures both swift and discreet. And then she added one final line. I want no space left for them to maneuver. On the other end, the man gave a low chuckle, brief but clear. Then his answer came, short and absolute. Fine, Naomi, we'll have it done before midnight. She lowered the phone, her fingers tapping lightly against the seat. This was only the beginning, but Naomi knew the moves were already falling into place. Piece by piece, the board was shifting to her design. Back at the Gilded Hall, they were still raising glasses, still laughing in triumph, oblivious that the game no longer belonged to them. Outside, the city pressed forward in its usual rhythm. But inside the car, Naomi sat like a conductor, baton poised in her hand. When she lowered it, the entire orchestra would change its tune. They believed her silence meant surrender. But in truth, within that silence, she was orchestrating moves powerful enough to collapse their glittering banquet in a single note. In the quiet cabin, Naomi set the phone aside. Outside, the street lamps carved streaks of light across her face, dividing it into halves, illumination and shadow, strength and restraint. She said nothing further, needing no explanation. Everything was already in motion. Now only silence remained. But it was not the hollow silence of defeat. It was the surface calm of the sea, beneath which currents raged, waiting to surge. Naomi sat straight, her eyes fixed on the city sliding past. Each glowing window, each flashing sign reflected the scorn she had endured tonight. But this time, they did not sting. They only fueled the fire within her, condensed under a cold layer of composure. She understood one truth. In battles of power, shouting often signals you've lost control. But silence, when held long enough, carries the weight to suffocate a room. And tonight, Naomi chose silence. Silence honed sharp, silence restrained, silence like a hunter holding breath before pulling the trigger. In the darkness, her eyes gleamed with steel. She saw herself reflected in the glass, not as a woman defeated, but as someone waiting for the precise moment to emerge with force that would leave them stunned. Every insult, every betrayal, every lie, they had become the fuel, compressed inside her like steam in a chamber. And when the pressure burst, it would be unstoppable. Naomi closed her eyes, inhaled deeply. The city roared on, but inside her time held still. This waiting was not weakness, it was preparation. It was the rest before the crescendo, the breath before the orchestra shifted into a new key. Even the driver sensed it. Though unaware of the story unfolding, he felt the charged silence around Naomi. He dared not speak, dared not break it. He knew only this. The woman behind him was carrying a storm. Naomi opened her eyes, a fleeting smile cutting across her lips. Not gentle, but edged. A signal of what was to come. She knew when she returned, those laughing inside the gala would no longer laugh the same. They thought her silence was submission. In truth, it was only the thin veil over a power waiting to erupt. And when it erupted, no one would escape the aftershock. The clock's hands inched toward midnight, each tick echoing like an invisible reminder in the heart of the city. Inside the grand hall, chandeliers blazed as if it were broad daylight, casting their glow over faces slick with wine and powder. The atmosphere had shifted into another rhythm. Intoxication, arrogance, and the brand of pride only those who believe themselves untouchable dare to flaunt. The MC strode onto the stage, adjusting his silk tie, his eyes glittering under the lights. He raised a glass of champagne, his voice rolling smoothly, trained by countless nights of playing this role. Ladies and gentlemen, he declared, let us raise a toast to tonight's dazzling success. A night of charity, of generosity, of an unshakable spirit of high society. Applause rippled across the white draped tables like a wave. Crystal glasses lifted in unison, colliding with a clink that rang hollow beneath the laughter spilling over them. People tilted their heads back, sipping with faces of self-satisfaction as if a single signed check had truly redeemed the world. From her car outside, Naomi could glimpse the spectacle through the tall windows, a hall drowning in illusion. To her, it looked like a grand stage, actors drunk on their roles, forgetting that the audience had already seen through the script. They toasted themselves, blind to the brutal truth beneath the numbers they flaunted. The longer she watched, the more the MC's smile seemed strained. Behind the flowery words lay a simple, laughable reality. There was no compassion here, only a carefully dressed cover for swollen wallets. Naomi let out a quiet, sharp laugh to herself. Inside, the MC droned on, praising the generosity of the people seated before him, calling them pillars of society. Each word fell like something etched in stone, but to Naomi they rang like hollow bells. And in that hollowness, she saw her opening. For when people are drunk on self-congratulation, that is when they are most vulnerable. And that was when the board was ripe for a reversal. They thought the midnight chime would mark nothing but triumph. But they didn't know it was also the signal for a twist that would shatter their illusion. The stroke of 12 rang out. Then, suddenly the hall went black. The chandeliers died. A heavy darkness blanketed the room, slicing off the violin's note mid-breath. Laughter, glass, music, all silenced at once. What replaced it was a ripple of unease. "What's going on?" a man's voice barked. "Has anyone checked the generator?" a woman in a red gown gasped. In the dark, chairs scraped, whispers rose. Panic spilled across the room. Faces that once beamed with pride now exposed raw fear. Without light, the hall was nothing, a hollow room where power shrank into trembling breaths. Then the lights blazed back on. But it wasn't the same. For on the stage, it wasn't the MC anymore. It was Naomi. She stood still yet commanding, her black dress catching the reborn light, her posture unshaken. Against the sea of tuxedos and glittering gowns, her presence burned. The MC stumbled backward, clutching his microphone like a useless prop. Naomi walked to the podium, not hurried, not timid. Each step struck like a drumbeat in the chest of those watching. Silence followed her now, not the silence of exclusion, but the silence owed to the rightful center of the stage. Every gaze locked on her. Even Richard, who had promised and then betrayed, sat frozen, his face burning not with wine but humiliation. Around the VIP tables, whispers tangled and fell, words swallowed before they formed. Naomi placed her hands on the podium. She didn't rush to speak. She didn't need to. Already everyone knew the order they had taken for Eternal had just been undone. Her voice came calm, steady, slicing through the thick air. "Perhaps tonight many of you thought I didn't belong here. But let me correct something." She paused. Silence dropped like a curtain. Naomi tilted her head, a cold smile brushing her lips. "This building, where you stand, where you toast yourselves as saviors of society, no longer belongs to tonight's hosts. I've purchased it outright. The papers were signed tonight." A gasp swept the room. Glasses trembled, a silver spoon clattered against a plate. One woman clutched her pearls as if the ground had quaked beneath her. No one believed what they heard. Hours ago, Naomi had been barred at the door, dismissed like an outsider. And now she stood before them as the rightful owner of the very hall they had flaunted as their fortress of privilege. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came. He knew any protest would only expose his ruin. Around the hall, faces turned pale as though they had been slapped awake. Naomi didn't need to raise her voice. The truth alone struck with enough force to crush the old order. "You may continue raising your glasses, but remember this. From tonight on, you are drinking under my roof." The orchestra in the corner froze, instruments limp in their hands. Even they knew the scene unfolding had slipped beyond music. Naomi stepped back, her gaze sweeping across the room. She didn't need to speak another word. The silence she left behind carried more weight than the announcement itself. They thought she would forever linger outside the door, begging entry. But in this moment, she hadn't just stepped in. She had made the entire hall her own. The gilded hall, once swollen with arrogant laughter, now drowned in thick silence. Crystal glasses trembled in unsteady hands, but no one dared raise them to clink anymore. The luxury that had been worn like armor now lay ripped apart, exposing the raw faces of the stunned and stripped. The drunk man, the one who had mistaken Naomi for a servant, now kept his head bowed, his glass drained, the trembling outline of his hand pressed against its hollow bottom. The woman who had smirked and declared, "This place is for those who belong," sat frozen, lips pressed tight, her crimson lipstick glaring like a fresh wound. Those who had once whispered mockeries at the door now lowered their eyes, terrified that Naomi's gaze might fall on them. And the organizers, the self-proclaimed hosts of the night, sat slumped, faces downcast. No longer the towering elites they fancied themselves, but like schoolchildren, caught cheating on an exam, unable to meet the teacher's eyes. They lowered their heads not only because Naomi had unveiled the truth, but because they knew it themselves. Tonight's reversal could not be undone. Whispers stirred among the tables, but unlike the earlier whispers of scorn, these now carried a different tone: confusion, shame, and fear. A few guests turned to glance at the doors, desperate to flee, but none dared stand. To leave now would be to admit defeat. Naomi said nothing. She let the silence do its work. And that silence fell like a mirror, forcing each person to see their own distorted reflection. The cruelty of their laughter, the venom of their words now thrown back in their faces. Richard, the old friend who had betrayed her, dabbed sweat from his brow. He tried to rise, but his legs betrayed him. The treachery he thought buried forever now stood naked under 100 eyes. Naomi did not need to condemn him. Her silence suffocated him more than any accusation ever could. In that moment, Naomi understood. The greatest power was not in shouting or striking, but in forcing those who once mocked the pain of others to confront their own smallness. They had thought Naomi was the outsider, unworthy of stepping inside. But now it was they who were cast out, adrift in the very hall they once claimed as their stage. And the cruelest truth of all, they had no one to blame but themselves. They thought humiliation belonged only to Naomi. Tonight it was they who were exposed. Naomi stood in the blaze of chandeliers, her poise serene, in stark contrast to the chaos boiling beneath. The hall fell so silent, no one dared breathe too loudly. Everyone waited for a fiery speech, for revenge, for words sharpened with rage. But Naomi did none of it. She did not scream. She did not gloat. She did not weaponize the stage for hate. Instead, she let her gaze sweep across each face, embedding the silence deeper, heavier than any scolding ever could. It was the kind of silence that forced arrogance to bow, the kind of silence that made mocking laughter echo back like a slap. Then Naomi leaned slightly, the microphone barely necessary, her voice carrying easily, low and sharp as steel. "If you wish to remain here, remember the name Naomi Carter. Just one sentence, no more." The words fell clean, final, slicing through the room like a blade. Not shouted, not angry, yet they chilled every ear. It was not just a claim of ownership. It was a warning. From this moment on, no one could erase her or diminish her presence again. In that instant, Naomi transformed her name into a symbol. No need for explanation, no need for demand. Just hearing it once was enough to scar, to burn itself into memory. They would remember, not because she forced them to, but because forgetting would expose their own weakness and cowardice. A few guests attempted a fragile applause, their hands clapping slow, disjointed, lifeless. Each clap was less a celebration than a bitter confession. They had lost. There was no covering it now. Naomi did not smile, nor bow, nor thank them. She simply stepped back, her gaze sweeping the hall one last time. That restraint made her words blaze even brighter, like a flash of a knife before it disappears, leaving only the sting. And in that fragile quiet, each person began to realize. Tonight was not just a failed gala, it was a night branded into memory, bound to a name, Naomi Carter. They had thought they could erase her with a torn invitation, but with a single sentence she carved her name into the very walls they thought she'd never touch. The chandeliers still blazed, desperate to cling to their false glory, but their light felt cold, sterile, like the glare of a morgue. No one touched their plates, no one lifted a glass. The violins, once so smug, were mute, drowned by a silence that sucked the air from the room. Naomi turned from the stage. No rush, no backward glance. Each step was unhurried, composed, as if she had always known the night would end this way. Her black gown skimmed the red carpet, not as the mark of an outcast, but as the seal of a victor leaving in silence. Eyes followed her, some filled with rage, some with shame, some with a quiet awe, but no one spoke. They had been trapped in her design. Speak and expose your pettiness, stay silent and choke on defeat. Naomi, with silence alone, had forced them to taste it. She passed through the great doors without hesitation. The same doors that once slammed shut in her face now opened effortlessly, as if they had never dared bar her. But Naomi did not linger in her triumph. She knew true justice does not need spectacle. It arrives quietly, but its echo lingers, gnawing at the soul long after. Inside, some guests shuffled out like mourners at a funeral, not attendees of a gala. Each step was proof of the truth Naomi had dropped. Those who thought themselves untouchable discovered how easily a fragile truth could topple their empire of lies. Outside, the night breeze swept through, the city lights still glowing, traffic still flowing. Naomi drew a slow breath, her face serene, untouched by the storm. Yet anyone who had witnessed knew, within that calm lay an unspoken declaration, that the most powerful answer is not always shouted, but in the way one stands tall, walks away, and leaves behind a silence the whole world must wrestle with. They thought Naomi was just a name they could erase from a guest list. But tonight, her silence turned that name into a bell that would never stop ringing. And its echo, would it keep those seated in that hall awake for years to come? If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.